Come settle in for our story. Tonight, our journey takes us into the sun-soaked, olive-rich world of ancient Greece, a civilization known for its deep philosophy, its pioneering democracy, and its art, which had a certain preference for foregoing trousers. Yet, beneath the celebrated legends of Plato, the fearsome Spartans, and their shining golden temples, there existed a far more difficult existence. While ancient Greece certainly laid the foundation for the Western world, the daily life of an ordinary person was a struggle that many of us today would find almost impossible to bear. So, before you get too settled, if you enjoy what we are creating here, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I would also love to hear where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It is always a true fascination to see our community connecting from every corner of the globe. Now, turn down your lights, perhaps switch on a fan for a soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's passage through history. Welcome to ancient Greece. Here, your morning starts not with a jarring alarm, but with the sun gradually turning your home into a slow-cooking oven. Your house is a simple structure, made of sun-dried mud bricks or coarse stone. It has small windows, but they hold no glass. Just wooden shutters meant to keep out curious goats and, if the gods are merciful, to let a small breeze drift through. There is no insulation to mention, no ceiling fan, and the idea of personal space is practically unheard of, unless you consider the one corner where the family goat is not currently napping. You awaken early, not from any sense of discipline, but because lying down has already grown uncomfortably warm. In the summer, these stone walls soak up heat like a sponge, and by sunrise, your little home is radiating that warmth right into your body. In the winter, those same walls become a natural cold chamber, leaving you wrapped in a single thin sheet, hoping to fend off frostbite. You have likely slept on a simple mat or a mattress filled with straw. Forget about pillows. A rolled-up cloak or your own arm had to serve that function. If you were lucky, the lice might have granted you a peaceful night, though such an event was probably quite rare. There is no running water, so your morning begins with a walk to the public fountain. If you live in the countryside, it involves the hard work of hauling water from a local well. You would need to balance heavy clay pots on your shoulders, hoping you don't trip and spill a week's worth of effort onto the dusty ground. As for bathing, that was not a morning activity. It was a ritual saved for the day's end, if it happened at all. You might splash some water on your face, rub olive oil onto your skin, and then scrape it all off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. Think of it as a spa treatment, but without the spa, the relaxation, or any real cleanliness. And privacy? It was not even a consideration. Your entire family shares a single room. You sleep, eat, and argue together over who tracked mud in from the street. The street, after all, serves as your hallway, your source of news, and your system for waste disposal. You have not even had your first meal, yet your back is already aching. You are covered in sweat, and your tunic is clinging unpleasantly to your skin. And this, believe it or not, is the best part of your day. So, you have made it through the sweltering heat of a Greek morning. Now, it is time for breakfast, a meal so scant it makes modern fasting look like a feast. Your first food of the day is barley bread. Dense, tough, and about as tempting as the dirt it was cooked on. This bread, called maza, is made from ground barley and water, formed into flat cakes, and baked on hot stones or in the embers of the previous night's fire. Imagine an ancient granola bar, but without any sweetness, good texture, or general pleasure. You might soften it by dipping it into watered-down wine, because the water itself is often not safe to drink. There are no advanced filtration systems, no boiling standards, and no modern water filters in your clay pots. Instead, everyone from young children to the elderly drinks wine mixed with water, not for the effect, but simply to survive. If you happen to be wealthy, you might also enjoy a fig, a few olives, or a bit of goat cheese. But realistically, you are probably not wealthy. You are fortunate if your bread is not covered in yesterday's flies and does not risk chipping a tooth. There is no coffee, no eggs, no fresh fruit, and no honey unless a reliable beekeeper lives nearby and you know how to bargain. Do not expect to sit and relax. Meals are eaten quickly. There are no chairs, no forks, and certainly no idea of mindful eating. You chew, you swallow, and you return to your work. And if you are a woman, you will not even eat with the men. In many homes, women and children ate separately, usually after the men had already finished. So not only is the food bland, but you also have to wait for the privilege of being disappointed by it. The great irony is that these are the same Greeks who created the symposium, a type of lavish banquet, and wrote beautiful poems about wine. But breakfast? That was not worthy of a single line of poetry. It was purely for function, often dry and scorched, yet you eat it like a champion because it is the only thing standing between you and a long day of hard labor under a relentless sun. Bon appetit, and try not to crack a tooth. After managing to get down your stale barley brick and a sip of wine-laced water, it is time to freshen up, or rather fail at it. In ancient Greece, hygiene was more about oil and ritual than it was about cleanliness. Soap was a fantasy for a future time. Your morning bath would usually mean pouring cold water over yourself at a public fountain or from a basin in the courtyard, unless you were one of the very few who lived near a public bathhouse. There was no shampoo, no refreshing body wash, and no sponge unless you acquired one from a diver in the Aegean Sea. Instead, you depended on olive oil. You would rub the oil into your skin, not to moisturize, but to gather the dirt and sweat. Then, you would carefully scrape it off with a strigil, that curved bronze blade that left you less oily but still not particularly clean. Imagine covering yourself in salad dressing and then shaving it off. That was the daily skincare regimen. And if that sounds even remotely pleasant, remember that everyone else was doing it too, often in public, completely naked, and with plenty of noise. Hygiene was a social activity in ancient Greece. Privacy was not. Now consider your teeth. Toothbrushes and toothpaste did not exist. If you were especially meticulous, you might rub your gums with crushed charcoal or rinse your mouth with vinegar. But for most, chewing on a twig and hoping for the best was the standard practice. Dental health was more a matter of luck than routine. As for body odor, it was everywhere. Deodorant was unknown, though perfumes were available to those who could afford them. You might put a drop of myrrh or rose oil on your neck before setting out on a 5-mile walk in sandals through the sweltering Athenian heat. This created a unique Greek aroma, a mix of musk, dust, and pure desperation. Laundry was done infrequently. Clothes were usually washed by beating them forcefully against rocks in a river. If you were poor, your tunic had likely not been washed since the last major festival. In short, hygiene in ancient Greece was not about looking or smelling good. It was about seeming slightly less unpleasant than you did the day before. The oil and scrape routine helped a little, but it could only do so much when you were sweating profusely in a linen tunic under a sun that seemed determined to bake you. So yes, ancient Greece gave the world democracy, philosophy, and incredible architecture. But a decent shower? That was still a distant dream. Now that you have scraped yourself clean with oil, it is time to put on your clothes. Spoiler alert, your ancient Greek wardrobe is, at its best, very limited, and at its worst, almost comically impractical. You have two main options, a chiton or a himation. Both are essentially large linen rectangles that you wrap around your body and fasten with a pin or a belt. They were not tailored or fitted, and they were definitely not designed for windy days. One strong gust of wind, and your entire philosophical stance could be revealed to the public. Forget about underwear. The concept simply did not exist, and bras were not a thing. So, unless you were a Spartan woman trained to sprint and wrestle, you just had to hope your pins held firm and that nobody noticed your clothing shifting like a loose curtain. Now, let's talk about what you wore on your feet. If you were lucky, you had a pair of leather sandals. If not, you went barefoot. This meant a full day of walking on sun-scorched stone, dirt packed down by goats, and whatever garbage the local market had left on the streets. Imagine walking across a hot pan in July while trying to avoid donkey droppings. That was your daily commute. Of course, there was no sun protection. There were no hats unless you were a farmer or sailor, and no sunscreen, since you were living in 450 BCE, and that kind of science had not been invented yet. The harsh Aegean sun did not care about your philosophical thoughts. It would simply bake you by noon. Your shoulders would be sunburned, your feet would be dirty, and your linen robe would stick to you in a number of awkward ways. And remember, public nudity was not considered shocking in Greek society. You might see men training naked at the gymnasium or even politicians giving speeches in togas that were barely held together. If you were wealthy, your tunic might be dyed a soft purple or a cheerful yellow. However, most people wore off-white or shades of brown because dyes were expensive, and no one would waste good color on someone who spent their days mending fishing nets. So, you would go about your day dressed like a burrito wrapped in a sheet, sunburned, sweaty, and always hoping your pin would not come undone at an inconvenient moment. And the worst part? You were only halfway through your daily tasks. Welcome to ancient Greece, where military service was not just a job. It was a fundamental part of being a citizen, a social requirement, and sometimes a direct path to an early grave. If you were a free male citizen, especially in a place like Athens or Sparta, you were considered enlisted. You were a soldier whether you wanted to be or not. By your teenage years, you would already be training with wooden weapons and learning the complex phalanx formation, that famous Greek battle tactic where you stood shoulder to shoulder behind huge shields, hoping the person next to you did not trip. In Sparta, boys started their military training at the young age of 7 in the Harshagoge system. This program was designed to turn children into hardened warriors by subjecting them to starvation, beatings, and isolation until only the toughest survived. In Athens, the system was less severe but still mandatory, 2 years of training in your late teens, followed by decades of being on call for military duty. You could not simply say, "I'm more of an intellectual." Even famous philosophers like Socrates fought in wars, not with witty arguments but with actual weapons. And there was always a war. Whether it was Sparta fighting Athens, Athens fighting Persia, or just a nearby city-state causing trouble over trade routes, conflict was a constant part of life. Peace was just the quiet time between invasions. As for armor, if you could afford it, you would have a bronze helmet, a breastplate, leg guards, a round hoplon shield, and a spear. If you could not, your best option was to stay away from the front lines. Leather and cloth were no match for arrows. The most frustrating part? You had to provide your own equipment. That is right, being a soldier was a bring-your-own-bronze affair. Poorer citizens had to beg, borrow, or fight with little protection, which in ancient Greece meant you were more likely to die first. When you were not actively fighting, you were preparing. Training, cleaning your weapons, debating strategy in the assembly, or rowing warships for hours as part of the Navy, because those triremes did not move themselves. There was no health care for veterans, no pensions, and no psychological support. There were only scars, permanent limps, and sometimes a roughly carved gravestone praising your courage. If life for a man in ancient Greece sounds difficult, just wait until you hear about being a woman. In most Greek city-states, especially Athens, women had fewer rights than a piece of decorative pottery. You could not vote, hold public office, own land outright, or appear in public without a male escort. In fact, if you were seen outside too often, people might start rumors that you were a courtesan or, even worse, a Spartan. Let's start with your daily tasks. You would wake up before the sun to begin your household duties. You would spin wool, weave cloth, grind grain, fetch water, bake bread, manage any slaves if your household had them, and raise the children. You were essentially the CEO of the household, but one with no pay, no recognition, and no days off. Your social life was extremely limited. You did not go to plays or take part in philosophical debates. You were not allowed in the gymnasium. That was a space for naked men only. You were mostly confined to the gymnasium, the women's quarters, and your contact with the outside world was limited to quick glances through latticed windows. What about education? If you were lucky, you might learn basic reading, but you were primarily trained in domestic duties. Philosophy, rhetoric, and geometry were subjects for boys. Your main purpose was to marry well, have sons, and remain as invisible as possible while doing it. Marriage usually happened at a young age, often in your early teens, to a man twice your age. The arrangement was made by your father, who saw you more as a strategic asset than as a person. Love was not required, but a dowry was. Once you had children, your value was mainly based on your ability to produce them. Now, Sparta was a significant exception. Spartan women were known for being more liberated. They received an education, exercised in public, and could own property. But before you get too envious, remember that their freedom was tied to a state-driven obsession with warfare and eugenics. Your main duty as a Spartan woman was to give birth to strong warriors or face social shame. And if your husband died, you could not inherit much, you could not remarry without official approval, and your options would quickly disappear. You were trapped, legally, socially, and often physically. So, while the Greeks worshipped powerful goddesses like Athena, Artemis, and Hera, real women were expected to stay silent, stay indoors, and stay out of sight. Ancient Athens is famous as the birthplace of democracy, and that is technically correct. But before you get too excited, let's be clear. You probably would not have been allowed to participate. In fact, the great majority of people living in Athens were completely shut out of the democratic process. To vote in the Athenian ecclesia or assembly, you had to be male, born to Athenian parents, a citizen, and over 18. This meant that women, foreigners, known as metics, slaves, and children, who made up nearly 90% of the population, had no political power at all. That was not democracy for everyone. It was democracy for a very select group of men in sandals. However, if you did fit the criteria, you were not just supposed to vote. You were expected to be involved constantly. Laws were proposed, intensely debated, and passed in huge assemblies of thousands of citizens. There were no professional politicians. Every eligible man served as a lawmaker, a jury member, and an overly confident amateur. You could even be chosen by a lottery to serve in important roles, like managing the treasury or sitting on a jury. This might sound exciting until you remember that there were no qualifications for these jobs. Your local fish seller might suddenly be in charge of military logistics one day, and your eccentric uncle who believed in sea monsters might be overseeing a murder trial the next. And what if someone became too powerful, too popular, or just annoyed the wrong people? Ostracism. Once a year, citizens could write a name on a piece of broken pottery, called an ostracan, and vote to exile that person for 10 years. There was no trial and no defense. Just, go away, you're getting too famous. And yet, for all its flaws, Athenian democracy was revolutionary. It gave ordinary men, at least some ordinary men, a voice, and it created the basic principles for future political systems. But it was not fair or inclusive. If you were a woman, you were silenced. A foreign resident who paid taxes? Silenced. A slave working on the Parthenon? Completely silenced. A philosopher who asked too many difficult questions? Potentially executed. Democracy was born in ancient Greece, but if you showed up expecting equal rights, you would have been politely shown out of the assembly and told to bring your own pottery shard next time. In ancient Greece, slavery was not just accepted. It was a fundamental part of society. Even a modest household usually owned at least one slave, not because the family was rich, but because slavery was so deeply integrated into the social structure that it seemed as normal as wearing sandals. The idea that someone might not own another person was almost unthinkable. Slaves did not come from a specific race. They were from conquered lands, Thracians, Scythians, Syrians, and even other Greeks from rival city-states who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some were born into slavery, some were captured in war, and others were kidnapped and sold. It was a thriving and cruel market, and the demand was always high. If you lived in Athens, your slave likely did every task imaginable. Preparing meals, fetching water, cleaning the house, caring for children, carrying your shopping, and standing quietly during dinner. Some even managed businesses or ran the household while the citizen owner relaxed at a symposium, drinking diluted wine and discussing abstract ideas like justice. The irony is staggering. In the silver mines of Laurion, slaves, including children, worked in terrible conditions. They crawled through narrow tunnels in total darkness, breathing in toxic dust, and slowly dying for the sake of coins and civic pride. Some slaves were educated. They taught grammar and math, worked as scribes, or even managed bank accounts. But they were still property. They could be beaten, branded, sold, or killed at any time, and they had no legal rights. The few who gained their freedom, known as freedmen, were never truly independent. They still had obligations to their former masters and could not become citizens. No voting, no owning land, just a small hope for a slightly better life. And unlike in later eras, there was no widespread movement to abolish slavery. Philosophers like Aristotle, yes, the famous Aristotle, actually argued that slavery was both natural and necessary. According to him, some people were simply slaves by nature. It is quite revealing, isn't it? Ancient Greece gave us ethics, democracy, and profound philosophy, but it was all built on the backs of people who were never allowed to speak, vote, or truly matter. And that is not just a small detail. It is the very foundation of their world. Feeling sick in ancient Greece? That is quite unfortunate because unless you happen to live next door to Hippocrates himself, your healthcare plan would probably involve some strange herbs, a lot of prayer, and a good deal of wishful thinking. Let's start with the basics. Hospitals, as we know them, did not exist. If you got sick or injured, you stayed at home. Maybe a neighbor knew something about making poultices. Maybe a relative remembered a prayer to Asclepius, the god of healing. Maybe your local temple had a sacred snake you could gently touch for spiritual comfort. That was pretty much the extent of it. The most famous Greek doctors were a mix of herbalist, philosopher, and gambler. They followed the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed that illness came from an imbalance of these vital fluids. So, if you had a fever, that meant you had too much blood. Time for a bloodletting. A cough? Too much phlegm. You should try fasting. Feeling sad? That was a sign of too much black bile. Maybe a thoughtful walk or a dramatic look at the sea was the prescribed cure. Most treatments were based on trial and error, with a generous use of garlic. You might be given crushed poppy seeds, boiled figs, or a poultice made from vinegar and something scraped off a goat. Did it work? Sometimes. Did it hurt? Almost always. Surgery was rare, frightening, and usually a last resort. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, even a small cut could get infected and become fatal. The tools included iron knives, bone saws, and lots of prayers. If an amputation was needed, you had better have a leather strap to bite down on. Midwives handled childbirth, which was a dangerous event even in the best of circumstances. The death rates for both mothers and babies were tragically high. One difficult birth, one baby stuck, and that was often the end. If you were rich, you might be able to call a traveling physician, someone with an actual medical scroll and some exotic oils. If you were poor, you had to rely on local folk remedies and your own resilience. Or you simply did not get better. But hey, at least they recommended rest, fresh air, and a balanced diet, so that's a small consolation. Ancient Greek medicine gave us the Hippocratic Oath, but it also gave us treatments like drink boiled cabbage water. So, yes, healthcare in ancient Greece was mostly a combination of herbs, hope, and grim determination. In ancient Greece, theater was not just a form of entertainment. It was a civic responsibility, a deeply religious ritual, and at times, a fiercely engaging experience for the soul. Let's start with the good news. Theater was free for citizens. Of course, if you were a woman, a slave, or a foreigner, you were out of luck. You would join thousands of other sweating citizens in a huge open-air theater carved into a hillside, like the Grand Theater of Dionysus in Athens, packed together shoulder to shoulder. And you would be there for the entire day. Seriously, all day. The Dionysia festival lasted from dawn until dusk with non-stop performances of tragedies, comedies, and satyr plays. There were no intermissions, no snacks, and definitely no designated restrooms, unless you counted a nearby bush. If you showed up late or misbehaved, you would not just get disapproving looks, you could actually be fined. The performances themselves were incredibly intense. Tragedies were emotionally draining, showing stories of murder, madness, war, and gods destroying families over a single bad decision made 3 generations ago. You did not go to the theater to laugh. You went to weep together with everyone else. Then there were the comedies, which were far from lighthearted family fun. These plays made fun of politicians, philosophers, entire cities, and bodily functions with amazing directness. Imagine if a late-night comedy show and a university debate team had a baby, then dressed it in a giant phallic costume and sent it on stage. Actors wore large masks, platform shoes, and exaggerated costumes. All roles, including female characters, were played by men, of course. The chorus would sing, dance, and shout commentary, like an ancient Greek version of social media, only much louder and wearing tunics. And this was not a passive experience. The audience was famously loud. They would boo, hiss, throw things, and get into arguments during the performance. Theater was like democracy with stage lights. If a play offended you, you let it be known. If it moved you deeply, you would shout, cry, and maybe rethink your entire life. At the end of the festival, a jury would vote on which playwright won the prize. Imagine spending 3 days feeling emotionally wrecked over Orestes, only to find out that some silly comedy about a talking pig god won the award. That, my friends, is ancient Greece for you. So yes, at the theater, you were never just a spectator. You were a participant and possibly an olive thrower. So you have survived your emotionally draining all-day theater marathon. Now you wander into the agora, the busy center of the city, and suddenly you meet a man in a cloak, barefoot, who keeps asking strangers, "What is justice?" Welcome to philosophy. It is everywhere and you cannot avoid it. In ancient Greece, especially in Athens, philosophy was like a local sport, and its stars were names we now associate with world-changing ideas. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Back then, however, they were just eccentric men who talked a lot and made other people doubt their own intelligence. Take Socrates, for example. The man made a career out of asking questions that often led nowhere and slowly chipping away at people's confidence in what they believed. You could be going about your day, maybe buying olives or petting a stray goat, and suddenly he would appear. Do you believe in truth? I suppose so. But what is truth? This would usually lead to 3 hours of mental exhaustion and a strong urge to move to Sparta. He never wrote anything down. His student Plato did that. But Socrates left a lasting impression, partly because Athens eventually executed him for being too annoying. Officially, the charges were corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. But let's be honest, he probably just would not stop asking questions during dinner. Philosophy was not a quiet, academic activity. It was loud, confrontational, and surprisingly intense. Debates happened in public places. They were spontaneous, heated, and often ended with bruised egos or deep existential crises. There were no microphones, just voices, hand gestures, and enough ego to fill the Parthenon. And if you thought you could just watch from the sidelines, think again. Philosophers loved to pull in random people. You did not just walk past Plato's academy, you were inevitably drawn into it. Say one slightly wrong thing, and you would instantly become the day's main example of an unexamined life. Even children were not safe. Aristotle famously tutored Alexander the Great, a teenager who would go on to conquer half the known world. Imagine your high school civics teacher giving you a globe and telling you to go fix this. So yes, philosophy gave us logic, ethics, science, and political theory. But in ancient Greece, it also guaranteed you a headache, an identity crisis, and about a 70% chance of being publicly humiliated by a man in sandals. So you have become successful in ancient Athens. You are well-spoken, smart, and politically active. People generally like you, maybe a little too much. That is your first mistake. Because in Athens, being too popular could get you kicked out of the city for a decade. Not arrested, not fined, just banished. This was not a secret plot or a shady deal. It was a formal part of the system. It was called ostracism, and it was completely legal, public, and terrifying. Once a year, the citizens of Athens would gather to decide if they should hold an ostracism vote. If enough people agreed, everyone would write the name of the person they wanted to exile on a broken piece of pottery. An ostracan. If someone got 6,000 or more votes, they were banished. No trial, no explanation. Just pick up your sandals and leave. You did not have to be a criminal. In fact, most people who were ostracized had done nothing wrong other than becoming too influential. Maybe you were a war hero, a great speaker, or you just had really nice hair. Whatever the reason, your fellow citizens decided you were becoming a threat to democracy, and democracy voted to send you away for a while. And here is the strange part. It was not permanent. Ostracism lasted for 10 years, and after that, you could come back as if nothing had happened. Your property was left untouched, and your citizenship was still intact. No hard feelings, just a decade-long vacation you did not ask for. Some famous Athenians were ostracized. Aristides the Just was so well respected that someone reportedly voted against him just because they were tired of hearing how good he was. Brutal indeed. Even Themistocles, the military genius who saved Athens at the Battle of Salamis, was exiled after he became too arrogant. Turns out that gratitude has an expiration date. Ostracism was meant to protect Athens from tyrants, but it often ended up punishing success. So, if you were ambitious, you had to walk a fine line. Be respected, but not too respected. Be popular, but not so charismatic that you made people nervous. Think of it like a reality TV show where the grand prize for having too many fans is being sent to the countryside with only your dignity and your olive oil. Athens gave birth to democracy, but it also invented cancel culture 2,500 years ahead of its time. In ancient Greece, you did not wonder if you were going to die young. You just wondered how soon and how painfully. Life expectancy was around 30 to 35 years, and that was if you survived infancy, which was a major accomplishment. About 1 in 3 children did not live past childhood, mostly because of disease, poor nutrition, and the fact that hygiene was more of an idea than a reality. You could die from almost anything. A small scratch that got infected, an unexplained fever, childbirth, a leading cause of death for women, or something as simple as drinking contaminated water. Medicine was basic, and divine help was not always reliable. If you lived in a city, diseases spread quickly. Crowded homes, open sewers, and public fountains made epidemics a regular part of life. The infamous plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War wiped out a third of the city's population. Thucydides wrote about it, then caught it himself, and miraculously survived. Most people were not so lucky. Warfare was constant. If you were a man, there was a good chance you would die holding a spear or rowing a warship. Even if you were not killed in battle, injuries often became fatal days later. There were no antibiotics, no advanced stitches, just hope and garlic compresses. And there was always the chance of dying from a divine temper tantrum. If you displeased a god, forgot a sacrifice, made fun of a temple statue, or spoke badly of Zeus after a few cups of wine, you might find yourself struck by a lightning bolt, a sudden plague, or an unexpected goat stampede. Burial rituals were very important. If your family could not afford a proper funeral, with coins for the ferryman and rituals to ensure your place in the afterlife, you might be unceremoniously thrown outside the city walls, with no marker and no memory. This was not just sad. It was spiritually dangerous. The Greeks believed that unburied souls would wander forever, trapped between worlds. Death was not a poetic idea. It was a daily reality, and it did not care about your philosophy, your beauty, or your family name. You could be a slave, a general, or a famous poet and still die from a moldy fig or an angry mosquito. The Greeks worshipped 12 Olympians, and it seemed like none of them were on your side. In theory, ancient Greek religion was about finding harmony with the gods, honoring Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, and the rest of the pantheon on Mount Olympus. In reality, it was a constant effort of spiritual crisis management. These gods were not calm, kind beings. They were moody, extremely powerful drama queens. Forget to make a sacrifice? They would ruin your crops. Say the wrong prayer? Your ship would sink. Wander into the wrong sacred grove. You would get a snake bite. Plague, famine, take your pick. The gods demanded not just your loyalty, but perfect timing, flawless rituals, and complete, unquestioning obedience. You did not just go to the temple once a week. You had daily rituals, home altars, seasonal festivals, and important civic ceremonies. Before planting crops, you prayed to Demeter. Going to war? Make a sacrifice to Ares. Traveling by sea? You had better pour out some wine for Poseidon, and maybe throw in a goat to be safe. Each god had their favorites and held grudges. Apollo might protect your city, unless your great-grandfather had once offended him, in which case you were cursed forever. Hera was the goddess of marriage, but she also specialized in making mortal women's lives miserable if Zeus even looked at them. Athena rewarded wisdom, but also had a habit of turning people into spiders. Casual. And if the Olympians were not enough to keep you on edge, there were nymphs, satyrs, spirits, river gods, and monsters hiding around every corner. Step on the wrong piece of sacred ground, and suddenly your left leg might belong to an angry woodland spirit. But perhaps the most stressful part was never knowing why something terrible happened. Was it a bad offering? Bad timing? Did you insult a god in a dream? Maybe it was your cousin's fault. Maybe it was something your great-grandfather did. It did not matter. The gods worked in mysterious and very personal ways. And yet, despite all the fear, Greek religion was deeply connected to every part of life, from politics and childbirth to the grand Olympic Games. You feared the gods, yes, but you also depended on them completely. Their temples were major city landmarks. Their festivals were national holidays, and their myths explained everything from lightning to the feeling of love. You did not believe in the gods out of blind faith. You believed out of a basic survival instinct. So, after thinking about everything, the sun-baked houses, the barley bread breakfasts, the blister-causing walks in sandals, the constant wars, plagues, unpredictable gods, and various goat-related traumas, let's ask the question directly. Would you really survive a single day in ancient Greece? Honestly, no. You would probably collapse before lunch. The intense heat, the boring diet, and the constant threat of war or divine punishment would quickly destroy any romantic ideas you might have about wearing a toga. You are not used to hauling water before breakfast or squatting over a hole in the ground next to a temple goat. You would desperately miss your running water, your aspirin, and your basic right to complain without being exiled by a piece of pottery. You might love the idea of living among beautiful marble statues, brilliant philosophers, and epic poets, but here is the reality. Those were the privileged 1% of ancient Greece. For everyone else, it was a life of hard labor, very few rights, and frequent funerals. Your democracy, only if you were a male citizen. Your medicine, garlic and pure hope. Your gods, often angry. Your social media, a man in the agora loudly debating justice while waving a fish around. And yet, despite all these difficulties, the Greeks endured. They built temples that still stand today as proof of their skill, wrote plays that we still perform, debated ideas that still challenge us, and laid the groundwork for everything from astronomy to ethics. They did not just put up with hardship. They built an entire civilization while sweating through it. You would not last, but they did. Not because life was easy, but because they found ways to create meaning in a world full of chaos. They questioned everything, fought constantly, wrote with incredible beauty, died young, and yet somehow managed to profoundly shape the modern world. So no, you probably would not make it past your first sunstroke, goat bite, or unsolicited philosophy lecture in the street. But if you did, if you adapted, persevered, and listened closely, you would find yourself among some of the most passionate, resilient, and brilliantly imperfect people history has ever known. And they would not judge you for struggling. They would just hand you a tunic, point to the amphory, and say, "Good, now carry that up a hill." Our story begins with a death, and with a promise broken. Persutigus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now eastern England, had played the Roman game skillfully. For years, he had balanced on a tightrope, ruling as a client king in the shadow of the Roman Empire. He had wealth, freedom, and peace, as long as he remained useful to Rome. But when he died around 60 AD, he left a will that was intended to keep his people safe. He named the Roman emperor as a co-heir along with his 2 young daughters, hoping this act of loyalty would ensure their safety and independence. He was mistaken. Rome did not honor the will. Rome did not negotiate. Rome simply took. The Roman authorities immediately annexed the Iceni kingdom. Their soldiers swept in and seized everything: land, livestock, homes, and treasures. But the theft of property was not the worst of it. It was their next act that transformed a political insult into a personal nightmare. They whipped the queen, Boudica, in public, not just to shame her, but to send a clear message: "You are nothing." And as if that were not enough, they violated her daughters in front of her. This was not just a suppression. It was psychological warfare designed to crush a people's spirit. But it did not crush Boudica. It forged her. Rome thought it had broken a minor tribal woman under its heel. What it had actually done was awaken a lioness, a queen who would turn her pain into vengeance, a mother whose anger would soon set cities on fire, a woman who would remind Rome that even empires can bleed. News of the atrocity traveled quickly through Britannia. Other tribes listened. They recalled their own humiliations, their own lost lands, their own sons who had died in Roman wars. Rome believed the tribes were divided and scattered. But in that moment, they shared one thing: Boudica's fury. What started with Rome violating one queen would soon end with the empire trembling in fear. They had broken a treaty, broken a family, and in doing so, they had shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility in Britannia. This was not just a mistake. It was the spark that would ignite one of the most savage revolts Rome ever faced. If Rome thought Boudica would fade away quietly, they misunderstood her completely. Boudica was not born to follow orders. She was born to lead. Roman historians, who rarely gave compliments to their enemies, described her as tall and fierce, with fiery red hair that fell to her waist and a voice that cut through a crowd like a battle horn. She was not just a queen by birth. She was a symbol, and now she was a danger. But before she became a danger, she became something more profound: a mother with nothing left to lose. Roman cruelty had attempted to destroy her dignity, her children's future, and her people's pride. But Boudica refused to be a victim. She understood that what Rome feared most was not an army, but unity. And so, she started to build it one tribe at a time. First, the Trinovans. They had once been a powerful tribe before Rome crushed them with taxes, land seizures, and forced labor. When Boudica spoke, she did not sound like a diplomat. She sounded like a warrior mother, scarred but not broken. She reminded them of their ancestors, their gods, and the land they no longer possessed. Her pain became their pain. Her anger became theirs too. Then other tribes began to listen: the Cativalani, the Corialtavi, even some of the Brigantes. Her cause was no longer just about revenge. It became a sacred mission to rid Britannia of Roman arrogance. She did not promise them safety. She promised them glory and, if necessary, an honorable death. And they followed her, because she did not stand behind her warriors. She rode among them, spear in hand, her hair flowing in the wind, her eyes fixed on the future. She called out the names of the violated, the enslaved, the executed. She called upon gods like Andraste, the Celtic war goddess, to be her witness. And her warriors believed her when she said the gods would fight alongside them. She had no formal military training, no Roman strategy books, but she possessed something far more deadly: a righteous fury, sharpened by betrayal and guided by purpose. And the land itself seemed to stir under her command. This was not a rebellion. It was a resurrection. The queen that Rome thought it had broken was now the leader of a movement that would soon make the empire tremble. And she was only just beginning. The Roman eagle had long flown over Britannia, but now the winds were shifting. Boudica's fury was not a wildfire. It was a gathering storm, building with frightening purpose. And storms require fuel. That fuel came from the thousands of Britons who had waited for years, even generations, for someone to challenge the empire. Someone to speak not in Latin, but in blood and iron. She gave them that voice. It began with war councils held in sacred groves and under moonlit hills. Boudica did not sit on a throne. She stood in the dirt with her people. She listened to the anger of the tribal elders, the sorrow of mothers, and the chants of druids who saw omens in the sky. They all spoke of a single truth: Rome had gone too far. Now it was time to push back. Warriors from the Trinovans brought spears, slings, and ancient battle cries. The Iceni contributed cavalry, fast riders with wild hair and war paint, fierce and unafraid. Other tribes joined with axes, blades, and torches. Even women took up weapons inspired by their queen. This was not just an army being formed. It was the rebirth of Celtic identity. But Rome had trained legions, professional soldiers, armored, disciplined, and deadly. Boudica had to compensate with numbers, her knowledge of the land, and something Rome could never teach: a hatred born from humiliation. Soon, Boudica's army grew to tens of thousands. Farmers became warriors. Hunters became assassins. Former Roman slaves and mistreated tribal allies changed sides. These were not soldiers fighting for pay. They fought for memory, for revenge, and for the right to raise children free from chains. She gave a speech, the first of many. Roman historians would later write down her words, though with their own bias, but what rings through time is clear. She vowed to either win or die. There would be no surrender, no submission, no retreat. Then came the first target, Camulogenum. Once a British stronghold, it was now a Roman colony filled with temples, statues, and villas. The Temple of Claudius stood as an insult, a shrine to the emperor who had conquered them. To Boudica and her warriors, it was not sacred. It was a challenge, and it would be the first to burn. The tribes were no longer whispering about rebellion. They were marching towards it, armed with rage and led by a queen who refused to bend her knee. Camulogenum never had a chance. The once proud Roman colony had become a symbol of everything Boudica's people hated. Its streets echoed not with tribal chants, but with Latin commands. Its buildings stood on sacred ground, and towering above it all was the Temple of Claudius, a marble insult built with forced labor, honoring the emperor who had conquered the Britons. To Rome, it was a monument. To Boudica, it was a target. She gave the command. What happened next was not a siege. It was an eradication. Her army swept down like a tidal wave. Roman settlers, many of them veterans who had bullied and taxed the local tribes, were taken by surprise. The city had no proper walls. The few Roman soldiers stationed there were ill-prepared, expecting peace, not war. They tried to defend the temple, barricading themselves inside, thinking it could withstand a siege. Could not. Within 2 days, Boudica's forces broke through. The streets ran red with blood. They spared no one. Men, women, and children were all killed. Boudica's war was not just military. It was deeply personal. Her warriors smashed Roman statues, burned villas, and directed their rage at the very symbols of occupation. The temple was set on fire, its roof collapsing in a blaze that lit up the sky for miles. Survivors were few, and those who managed to escape brought back stories of horror that chilled Roman hearts. The fury was not random. It was methodical. These were people who had seen their homes taken, their gods mocked, and their daughters sold. Now, they were taking back what had been stolen with interest. Roman officials sent desperate pleas for help to Governor Suetonius, who was hundreds of miles away in Wales, putting down another rebellion. But by the time he learned of Camulogenum's fall, it was already just ash and smoke. A colony destroyed, its people dead, and the fire of rebellion burning brighter. Boudica did not linger to celebrate. There was no time. She knew Rome would retaliate, and with force. So she pushed onward, knowing that every victory gave her more momentum. Her next target was a city that was larger, richer, and even more exposed, Londinium. If Rome had not taken her seriously before, they would now. Camulogenum was the start, but it was not revenge. Not yet. Not until the empire's heart in Britannia felt the flames. Londinium was the prize of Roman Britannia. Founded only 17 years earlier, it had quickly become a bustling center of trade and government. Merchants from all over the empire crowded its markets. Officials handled imperial matters under tiled roofs. Wealth moved through its streets like a river. But as Boudica's army drew closer, that wealth turned to terror. Governor Suetonius, having hurried back from Wales with a small force, arrived just before the rebels. He looked at Londinium, crowded, sprawling, and undefended, and made a cruel choice. He abandoned it. The Roman legions stationed elsewhere were too far away to help. Suetonius could not afford to risk his few troops in a city he could not defend. So he retreated, taking with him anyone who could escape. He left behind the old, the sick, the stubborn, and those who were too slow to believe that an army led by a woman could bring down Rome. They were about to learn their mistake. Boudica's forces descended upon Londinium like a storm. There were no walls to climb, no gates to break. The city was wide open, and she made it bleed. Her warriors tore through the streets with the fury of generations. They did not loot. They did not occupy. They annihilated. The killing was methodical. Roman citizens were dragged from their houses. Entire families were slaughtered. Some were impaled, others burned alive in temples. No mercy was shown, and no Roman symbol was left standing. Villas were set on fire, and warehouses exploded in flames. The black smoke could be seen for miles, a dark stain against the British sky. This was not just a massacre. It was a declaration. The message was clear: Rome is not invincible. Contemporary Roman sources like Tacitus and Cassius Dio estimated that tens of thousands were killed. Some accounts claim the brutality was even worse than what happened at Camulogenum. To the Romans, this was not just a rebellion. It was an apocalypse, and through it all rode Boudica. She did not hide behind her commanders. She led from her chariot, her daughters by her side. She watched as the pride of the empire crumbled before her. This was not senseless violence. To her, it was justice for what Rome had done to her family, her people, and her land. And she was not done. Ahead of her lay another Roman center, Verulamium, and beyond that, the full force of Rome's retaliation. Rome had dealt with rebellions before. It had fought wars on different continents, but it had never seen anything like Boudica. She was not a general trained in military tactics. She did not speak Latin. She did not wear polished armor. Yet she had burned 2 Roman cities to the ground and killed thousands, both citizens and soldiers. And now, as Verulamium, a wealthy Romanized town northwest of Londinium, also went up in flames, the empire started to panic. News of her rampage reached the Roman Senate. Emperor Nero himself reportedly thought about pulling out of Britannia completely. Imagine that. An empire that stretched from the deserts of Africa to the mountains of Germania considering retreat because of one woman with a chariot and a cause. That is how much she terrified them. In reality, Boudica's power was not just in her army. It was in what she stood for. Rome saw itself as unbeatable, its cities as eternal, and its rule as destiny. But here was a Celtic queen, once beaten and shamed, now leading a revolt that had turned entire Roman settlements into ash. Every new city she burned was not just a strategic win. It was a psychological defeat for Rome. Verulamium met the same fate as Camulogenum and Londinium. It was rich, Romanized, and completely undefended. Boudica's warriors slaughtered the people, destroyed the temples, and leveled the Roman buildings. Archaeological evidence today still shows a thick layer of ash beneath the modern town. A fire so intense that it left a scar on the earth itself. But here was the problem. With each victory, Boudica's war effort became more difficult to manage. Her army grew larger, but her supply lines became strained. Organization began to break down. Drunk on their success, some tribes grew careless. And Rome, known for its ability to recover, was regrouping. Governor Suetonius was not sitting idle. He had retreated, but he had not surrendered. He began gathering reinforcements, pulling in battle-hardened legions from across the province. He looked for high ground, studied the terrain, and prepared for one final, decisive battle. Still, even as Roman strength was rebuilding, there was one fear in every soldier's mind. Could they stop her? Because Boudica was not just fighting a war. She was rewriting the story of conquest. And she was proving, one burning city at a time, that Rome could bleed and that queens could strike back. The final battle was approaching, and the empire held its breath. The fire had burned as far as it could. Now the storm had to meet steel. Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus had picked his battlefield with care. He was not just any Roman officer, he was a survivor. While Boudica's warriors were celebrating their victories, Suetonius was making calculations. He chose a narrow valley, a tight space enclosed by forest and hills where Boudica's larger numbers would not matter as much. His army was small, perhaps 10,000 men, but each one was a trained killer, forged in the discipline of the Roman legions. Boudica's force, on the other hand, was enormous. Some sources say up to 200,000 warriors marched with her. But they were not soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, tribal chiefs, and people seeking freedom, inspired but not disciplined, armed with rage but not with strategy. They believed their numbers would overwhelm Rome like a tidal wave. They were mistaken. As Boudica's army drew near, she gave one final speech. Standing in her war chariot, with her daughters beside her, she reminded them of their suffering, of the whippings, the assaults, the stolen lands, the burned homes. She called on the goddess Andraste, invoked their ancestors, and vowed to either win or die. Her warriors roared in agreement. They believed the gods would lead them to victory. Then the battle started. The Britons charged. They filled the field with a wild fury, but Suetonius stood his ground. He let them get close, packed tightly into the narrow space. Then, at the perfect moment, he launched the Roman counterattack. Spears flew in disciplined volleys. Shields locked together. The short Roman swords, called gladii, cut deep into the confused mass of warriors. Wave after wave of Britons crashed against an iron wall, and each time they were broken. Then the Romans advanced, step by step, disciplined, precise, and ruthless. Behind the Britons, wagons and families had followed the army, expecting to watch a Roman defeat. Instead, they became a deadly trap. The warriors could not retreat. Panic spread. The narrow battlefield turned into a slaughterhouse. When the dust finally settled, it was all over. Tens of thousands of Britons lay dead. The rebellion was crushed. The empire had bent, but it had not broken. Boudica had thrown everything she had at Rome, and though she lost the battle, the memory of her defiance would echo louder than the sound of clashing swords. Her final fate would remain a mystery, but her legend was already immortal. The battlefield fell silent, the noise of war replaced by the moans of the dying. Boudica had lost not just a battle, but a war she had started with her own hands. The ground was soaked with the blood of her people, and the ashes of their hopes drifted on the cold British air. And Boudica? She was gone. There are no eyewitness reports of her last moments, no clear accounts of her death. Roman historians give different stories. Some say she took poison, choosing death over being captured. Others suggest she fell ill and died quietly after the battle. But they all agree on one thing: she vanished. No queen in chains was ever marched through the streets of Rome. There was no public execution, no final humiliation. She simply disappeared, like a storm that had burned itself out. But in her disappearance, something remarkable happened. She became more than a queen. She became a legend. Rome, shaken and shamed by the scale of her rebellion, tried to erase her memory, but it was too late. Boudica had become a name whispered in tribal songs and remembered in the sacred groves. To the Britons, she was not a defeated rebel. She was a martyr, a goddess of war and vengeance, a mother who had stood up to the world's most powerful empire and made it bleed. Even among the Romans, there was a grudging respect. Tacitus, though a loyal Roman, described her not as a barbarian, but as a powerful leader who had been wronged by the arrogance of the empire. Cassius Dio wrote of her commanding presence and terrifying speeches. They feared her, yes, but they also admired her determination. And over the centuries, Boudica refused to fade away. She would reappear in Victorian statues, in poems by Tennyson, in history books, and in school lessons. She became a symbol of defiance, especially for women who saw in her story a fire that could not be put out. Her chariot, with its spiked wheels tearing through time, became a symbol of resistance. And so, though her body may be lost to history, her voice never was. It rides on the wind, it screams in the fire, and it echoes in every soul that has ever stood against oppression and whispered, "I will not kneel." Centuries have passed since Boudica disappeared into the mists of history, but her shadow still lingers over the British Isles. You can see her name on monuments, hear it in political speeches, and feel her presence in the stubborn spirit of a land that never truly forgot her. In London, near Westminster Bridge, a bronze statue shows her standing tall in a war chariot, her daughters by her side, her eyes looking to the horizon, her wheels raised in defiance. Below her, traffic moves and tourists wander, unaware that they are walking in the echoes of her rebellion. But her legacy is not just in statues. It is in what she represents. Boudica became more than the sum of her battles. She became an eternal question posed to every empire, every oppressor, every ruler who forgets the power of the people. What happens when the silenced rise? She was not perfect. Her revolt was filled with bloodshed and massacres. Tens of thousands died at the hands of her warriors. But history is not written by saints. It is carved by those who dare to resist. And resistance is rarely a clean process. Still, what makes Boudica's story so enduring is not just her war against Rome. It is the fire she ignited in the human imagination. A woman who lost everything and still stood tall. A queen who refused to be defined by the empire that tried to break her. A mother who turned her grief into a sword. Modern historians continue to debate her exact role, her decisions, and her motives. But ask any Briton who Boudica was, and they will not recite historical footnotes. They will tell you she was the queen who made Rome bleed, the woman who united tribes that had once fought each other, the warrior who taught the world that dignity can rise even from ruin. And in that, she becomes more than a historical figure. She becomes a symbol of rebellion, of courage, of the unbreakable desire to be free. Because even when Rome rebuilt its cities and redrew its maps, it could not erase her. Her flame still burns in every fight against tyranny, in every voice that dares to say, "No!" and in every soul that would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. Boudica is gone, but her legend rides on forever. For the people of antiquity, sickness was never a matter of chance. It was not just about bacteria, viruses, or malfunctioning cells. Those ideas would come thousands of years later. In the ancient world, illness was a sign, not just of a physical problem, but of a deeper issue. A disruption of balance, a break in the harmony between the body, mind, soul, and the natural world. In Mesopotamia, disease was often seen as a punishment from the gods. If someone became ill, it was thought they had angered a god, broken a rule, or been cursed. A diagnosis started not with the symptoms, but with questions. What did you do? Who did you anger? Priests and healers worked together, reading omens, casting spells, and performing rituals alongside giving herbal remedies. In ancient China, balance was understood more systematically through the concepts of yin and yang and the five elements. Health was a state of equilibrium between these opposing forces. Too much heat or cold, dryness or moisture would throw the body out of balance. Practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine did not just treat a cough. They asked when it started, what time of day it was worse, and what emotions came with it. Healing was a holistic process. Herbs, acupuncture, and dietary changes were all used to rebalance the inner world of the patient. In Greece, the physician Hippocrates rejected the idea that gods punished people with disease, but he also saw health as a state of harmony. His theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, would dominate Western medicine for centuries. Each humor was connected to a personality type and an element. An excess or lack of one humor would cause both physical symptoms and changes in personality. A melancholic person, for example, was believed to have too much black bile. Across different cultures, one idea remained consistent. Health meant wholeness. It was not just the absence of pain, but the presence of balance. Whether it was the Ayurvedic concept of dashas in India or the belief in spiritual possession in African healing traditions, ancient people understood that a human being was not separate from the world. We were part of nature, and when nature was disturbed, it pushed back. So when ancient healers treated the sick, they were not just looking for physical signs. They were listening for imbalance. And they believed that to heal someone, you had to treat the invisible forces just as carefully as the visible wounds. In the land of pyramids and pharaohs, medicine was a mix of science and magic. Ancient Egyptian healers, known as SWNW, were not just doctors. They were sacred links between the body and the divine. Their medical practices were surprisingly advanced, yet deeply connected to ritual and magic. To the Egyptians, the body could bleed, break, and get sick, but its problems were never purely physical. The spirit, the gods, and even the afterlife all played a part in every illness. Much of what we know comes from medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus from around 1550 BCE. This ancient scroll lists hundreds of remedies for everything from toothaches to tumors. Egyptian doctors performed surgeries, set broken bones, treated infections, and drained abscesses with copper tools that were sterilized by fire. They knew how to check a pulse, how to examine urine and feces for diagnosis, and how to use a wide range of herbs, many of which are still used today. But no treatment ever started without a blessing from the gods. Thoth was thought to have given humanity the secrets of healing. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and plague, was both feared and prayed to. She could cause epidemics or grant recovery. Spells were often recited over a patient while herbs were being applied. Words had power. Incantations were not just empty phrases, they were a form of medicine. One of their most important tools was honey. It was used as an antiseptic long before bacteria were discovered. Wounds were bandaged with it, sometimes mixed with resin or lint. Garlic and onions were given for heart health. Castor oil was used as a laxative. Even moldy bread was pressed onto infected wounds, a primitive form of antibiotic centuries ahead of its time. Egyptian doctors treated not only common people but also royalty. Their skills were respected in other lands. Neighboring civilizations would send for Egyptian physicians to treat difficult cases. In a way, they were early specialists. Some focused on the stomach, others on the eyes, or even on spiritual problems. But in all their knowledge, there was no separation between the physical and the sacred. A fever might come from the Nile's mosquitoes or from an angry ghost. Healing the body meant pleasing the gods, purifying the soul, and restoring divine order. To the ancient Egyptian, a healer's true purpose was not just to cure the illness. It was to restore cosmic balance. Long before modern medicine appeared, India was already writing its own story of healing, one that saw the human body not as a machine, but as a reflection of the universe. This ancient system is called Ayurveda, a Sanskrit word that means the science of life. Rooted in the Vedic tradition, Ayurveda is more than just a medical practice. It is a philosophy, a way of living in harmony with nature, the seasons, and the spirit. Central to Ayurveda is the idea of the three dashas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Each one represents a unique mix of the five elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Vata controls movement, Pitta governs transformation like digestion, and Kapha manages structure and stability. Everyone is born with a unique balance of these dashas. According to Ayurveda, illness occurs when this balance is upset by a poor diet, stress, the environment, or lifestyle. Ayurvedic texts like the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita are over 2,000 years old. These detailed books offer not just herbal remedies, but also advice on surgery, childbirth, psychology, and even ethics for doctors. Charaka focused on internal medicine, promoting prevention as the best defense. Sushruta, on the other hand, is remembered as a pioneer of surgery, describing over 300 surgical procedures and more than 120 surgical tools, many carved from wood or metal. One of his most amazing techniques was rhinoplasty, reconstructing a nose using a flap of skin from the patient's cheek or forehead. This was not for cosmetic reasons. It was often used to repair faces that had been mutilated as a form of punishment. Thousands of years before Western medicine caught up, Sushruta had already set the stage. But Ayurveda's strength is in its holistic approach. Healing the body cannot be separated from healing the mind and soul. Treatments include herbal medicine, yoga, breathing exercises, pranayama, oil massages, abhyanga, and meditative fasting. Plants like turmeric, ashwagandha, neem, and tulsi were not just food. They were medicine, purifiers, and protectors of the life force. An Ayurvedic healer might treat a fever not just with herbs, but by adjusting your sleep schedule, looking at your emotional health, and cleansing your digestive fire or agni. Ayurveda teaches that you are not separate from nature. You are nature. And when you get sick, it is nature's way of calling you back to balance. In ancient China, health was never just about the body. It was about energy. The invisible life force called qi, pronounced qi, flowed through every living thing, and the key to wellness was making sure that qi moved freely, without being blocked or in excess. This fundamental idea would shape one of the oldest continuous medical systems in the world, traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. To understand illness, ancient Chinese physicians first had to understand nature. They watched the rhythms of the seasons, the phases of the moon, the behavior of animals, and the movement of the cosmos. From these observations came two main principles: yin and yang, and the five elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Yin and yang represented balance in everything. Yin was cool, dark, passive, and internal. Yang was hot, bright, active, and external. Every organ, emotion, and function of the body was categorized under these opposing but complementary forces. Health, then, was a dynamic balance between them. A fever was not just a high temperature, it was an excess of yang. Fatigue might mean a lack of yin. Diagnosis was an art form. Physicians did not rely on tools. They relied on their senses. They looked at the tongue, felt the pulse in multiple places, listened to the tone of the voice, and asked questions about dreams, emotions, and digestion. Every detail gave them insight into the balance of qi. To restore health, they used a wide range of methods. Acupuncture, the insertion of fine needles into specific points along the body's meridians, was used to unblock qi and restore its flow. Moxibustion, the burning of the mugwort herb near these points, was used to warm and stimulate circulation. Cupping, herbal formulas, qigong exercises, and strict dietary changes all played important roles. The ancient text, Huangdi Neijing, or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, written about 2,000 years ago, is still the foundation of TCM today. It did not just list diseases. It explored their causes, prevention, and lifestyle. It taught that emotions like anger, grief, and fear could disrupt the organs, and that healing required emotional balance as well as physical treatments. Chinese medicine never separated the person from the world around them. To treat the body, one had to treat the climate, the soul, and the unseen energy within. In every heartbeat, the ancients believed qi was speaking, and the healer's job was to listen. In the temples of ancient Greece and the forums of Rome, medicine started to move away from the divine and towards the world of reason. But even here, the body was still seen as a delicate ecosystem, governed by balance and temperament. And at the heart of this view was a theory that would shape Western medicine for over 1,000 years: the four humors. Developed by the Greek physician Hippocrates and later expanded by Roman doctors like Galen, this theory proposed that the human body was controlled by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked to an element: air, water, fire, and earth, and to a specific personality type. A healthy person had these fluids in balance. Illness, it was believed, was simply the result of having too much or too little of one of them. If someone was feverish and aggressive, they might have too much yellow bile. Choleric, imbalance. A sluggish, pale patient could be suffering from an excess of phlegm, which was linked to cold and moisture. Treatment, therefore, was focused on restoring this balance through methods like bloodletting, purging, special diets, and baths. But the Greeks did not stop at fluids. They also believed in the healing power of observation and the environment. The Hippocratic Oath, which is still echoed in modern medicine, encouraged physicians to do no harm, to watch their patients carefully, and to treat the whole person, not just the disease. Hippocrates advised his students to consider the seasons, the winds, the quality of the water, and even the patient's mood. Healing sanctuaries known as Asclepians, named after the god Asclepius, were found throughout the Greek world. These were more than just hospitals. They were spiritual retreats. Patients slept in sacred dormitories, hoping to have healing dreams. Ritual purification, exercise, diet, and prayer were all part of the cure. It was a place where reason and religion coexisted. In Rome, medical practice developed further with the rise of Galen, a Greek physician who treated gladiators and emperors. He performed dissections on animals to understand anatomy, wrote hundreds of medical texts, and helped standardize the theory of humors across the empire. Although some of his ideas were incorrect, Galen's influence lasted for centuries. Greco-Roman medicine, despite its mystical origins, began to push towards a new idea: that the human body was a system, complex, yes, but understandable. And if it was understood correctly, it could be brought back into harmony, not just by the gods, but through reason, ritual, and the careful art of healing. Long before written texts and formal medical schools, indigenous peoples around the world were healing their communities with a deeper kind of knowledge, one passed down through stories, visions, and direct experience with the natural world. For these cultures, medicine was not a job. It was a way of life, woven into daily rituals, seasonal cycles, and sacred ceremonies. Among Native American tribes, healers were known as medicine men and women, but their role was much broader than just physical treatment. They were spiritual guides, storytellers, counselors, and guardians of ancestral wisdom. Illness was seen as a break in a person's relationship with nature, the tribe, the spirits, or themselves. Healing required more than just herbs. It required reconnection. Plants were essential to this practice. From the Cherokee to the Lakota, each tribe had an encyclopedic knowledge of the land. Which root to chew for pain, which leaf to brew for a fever, which bark to crush for a wound. Sage, cedar, sweetgrass, and tobacco were sacred plants, used in smudging rituals to cleanse both the body and the spirit. Yet, medicine was never just about the ingredient. It was also about intention, ceremony, and respect. Healers often worked with spiritual forces. They led sweat lodges, vision quests, and drumming circles. Illness could be caused by breaking a taboo, spiritual possession, or even soul loss, a condition where a part of the person's essence had fled due to trauma. In these cases, rituals like soul retrieval were performed, calling the spirit back through chanting, dancing, or guided trance. The same deep respect for nature is found in indigenous traditions all over the world. In the Amazon rainforest, shamans use powerful plant medicines like ayahuasca, a hallucinogenic brew used not for recreation, but for healing and insight. They believe the plants themselves are teachers, revealing the sources of suffering through visions. In Aboriginal Australia, bush medicine includes herbs, clays, and rituals passed down through the dreamtime, the ancestral era that still guides indigenous identity. Healing here is about balance between the body, the land, the ancestors, and the song lines. These systems were never written down in books. They lived in the songs, dances, and landscapes of the people. To indigenous healers, modern medicine may have its machines and labs, but the earth has always been the first pharmacy. And healing is not about defeating disease. It is about remembering who we are. In every ancient civilization, no matter the language, location, or belief system, there was one constant idea: that healing needed more than just herbs and surgery. It needed spirit. Whether illness was seen as a divine punishment, a soul imbalance, or a break from sacred forces, ancient people believed that true healing started in the unseen world, and the path to that world was through ritual. In Mesopotamia, long before formal medicine, people turned to exorcists and priests to fight illness. Diseases were thought to be caused by evil spirits or angry gods. Clay tablets show detailed healing rites, where chants were whispered as poultices were applied. Special figurines were buried under houses to keep sickness away. Rituals were not separate from treatment. They were the treatment. In ancient Egypt, no doctor worked without calling on the gods. Before putting honey on a wound or bandaging a limb, the healer would often recite prayers to Thoth, the god of wisdom, or Sekhmet, the goddess of healing and wrath. Illness was not just a physical attack. It was a cosmic imbalance. Healing meant realigning the patient with Ma'at, the principle of truth, order, and harmony. In many African traditions, healers called Ngangas or Sangomas used drumming, dancing, and divination to diagnose and cure. They spoke with ancestors, called upon spirits, and often entered trance-like states to travel the spiritual world on behalf of their patients. Herbs were important, but the unseen world was always consulted first. Even in classical Greece, ritual was a key part of healing. In the Asclepiad, sacred healing temples, patients went through rituals of purification, fasting, and prayer. At night, they slept in special dormitories, dreaming under statues of Asclepius, the god of healing. These dreams were then interpreted by temple priests to guide the treatment. Ritual was not just superstition, it was structure. It gave a shape to suffering, a language to pain, and a feeling that the illness had a purpose. Through symbolic acts, people could turn fear into hope, isolation into connection, and chaos into control. And more than that, it reminded them that they were not alone. Even today, science studies the placebo effect, the power of belief, and the healing impact of intention. The ancients did not need the data. They already knew. Sometimes, a word spoken with reverence can heal more deeply than any blade, because not all wounds are visible, and not all medicine is made of matter. When we think of ancient surgery, we often imagine crude tools, shaking hands, and terrible pain. But the reality is much more impressive and more human. Across the ancient world, surgery was done with surprising skill. These early healers did not have anesthesia, X-rays, or antiseptics, but they had courage, skill, and a remarkable understanding of the body, gained through generations of observation, trial, and often harsh necessity. In India, the Sushruta Samhita, written over 2,000 years ago, described more than 300 surgical procedures. This author, Sushruta, is known as the father of surgery. He described methods for removing tumors, setting bones, repairing hernias, and even reconstructing noses, a form of plastic surgery. His tools were sharp, diverse, and carefully organized. Forceps, scalpels, probes, and needles, many made of iron or stone. Sushruta stressed the importance of hygiene, surgical preparation, and understanding anatomy through dissection, though this was often limited to animals. His surgical knowledge spread far beyond India, influencing both Islamic and Western practices centuries later. In ancient Egypt, surgical knowledge was mixed with ritual. Papyrus texts show procedures for stitching wounds, treating dislocated limbs, and draining abscesses. Tools like bronze knives, bone saws, and cauterizing rods have been found in tombs. They even practiced trepanation, cutting a hole in the skull to relieve pressure or treat head injuries. Amazingly, many skulls show signs of healing, which means the patients survived. Trepanation was not only done in Egypt. In pre-Columbian Peru, archaeologists have found hundreds of trepanned skulls, often from warriors injured in battle. Some of these surgeries were surprisingly successful. In some areas, over 80% of patients survived, based on bone regeneration. These early surgeons may have used coca leaves or fermented maize beer to numb the pain, along with herbal antiseptics. In the Greco-Roman world, Galen improved surgical techniques by studying injured gladiators and dissecting animals. His understanding of the nervous system and blood vessels laid the foundation for later anatomy. Roman military surgeons treated wounds on the battlefield efficiently, using cautery, clamps, and ligatures. While surgery was always dangerous, it was also respected. It was the work of those brave enough to cut into life itself, hoping to bring health out of pain. These were not butchers. They were artists of the blade. And though their knowledge was limited, their legacy lives on every time a scalpel is used to heal, not to harm. Today, we live in a world of digital diagnostics, robotic surgeries, and genetic mapping. We can scan a body in seconds and send prescriptions across oceans with a click. And yet, in the quiet corners of modern medicine, the whispers of the ancient world can still be heard. You can find Ayurveda in yoga studios, Chinese herbal formulas on pharmacy shelves, and indigenous smudging ceremonies in hospitals to honor patients' traditions. Medical students still take a version of the Hippocratic Oath, promising to do no harm, just as their Greco-Roman predecessors once did. In operating rooms, we use precision tools that trace their origins back to Sushruta's iron instruments. Concepts like holistic care, preventative medicine, and the mind-body connection, now key parts of integrative health, are rooted in the wisdom of ancient civilizations that saw healing not as a task, but as a relationship. Even modern science has come full circle. Research increasingly confirms what the ancients believed, that stress, isolation, and emotional trauma can weaken the immune system, disrupt sleep, and cause physical pain. Meditation, once a spiritual practice, is now studied for its effects on brain health. Forest bathing, based on Shinto and indigenous nature practices, is prescribed for anxiety. And the placebo effect, healing powered by belief, continues to puzzle researchers who once dismissed it. It is easy to see ancient medicine as outdated superstition or primitive guesswork. But when we look closer, we see something profound. A worldview that saw illness not just as a broken machine, but as a disruption in one's being, a sign that something somewhere was out of harmony. And that idea still matters, because medicine is not just about treatment. It is about meaning, comfort, and being seen and understood. The ancients knew this instinctively. Whether they used chants, needles, leaves, or blades, they understood that healing was sacred. Today, as we push further into the future of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and personalized medicine, perhaps we are not leaving the ancient world behind. Perhaps we are returning to it with new tools, but with the same human heart. A heart that still craves balance, wholeness, and healing not just of the body, but of the spirit. Her name comes to us through history as if a faintly recalled tune, Sappho. A poet from the island of Lesbos, born around 630 BCE, whose voice once moved the hearts of listeners under starlit skies, and whose words, even in fragments, still echo with a sense of longing. Unlike the great warriors and kings of ancient Greece, Sappho's fame did not come from conquest, but from emotion. Her realm was not the battlefield, but the human soul. She wrote of love and jealousy, beauty and despair, joy and yearning. She captured fleeting moments, a glance, a blush, a shiver, and preserved them in her verses like pressed flowers, delicate yet timeless. Very little is known about her life. There are no portraits, no diaries. What we have are traces, a few lines saved by ancient scholars, quotes found in other works, and the tattered remains of papyrus scrolls lost to time. And yet, these fragments still shine. The Greek philosopher Plato called her the 10th muse. Centuries later, poets, translators, and dreamers would search for her, trying to piece her life together like an unfinished song. Sappho was likely born into a noble family on Lesbos, an island in the northeastern Aegean Sea. This was a place of music and learning, where poetry was part of the fabric of daily life. She may have had siblings, a daughter, and even political rivals, though the records are unclear. She lived through exile and turmoil, through times of silence and times of song. Her world was one where most women's voices were kept within the home or silenced completely. But Sappho defied that silence. She stood out not through rebellion, but through beauty. She wrote in the Ialic dialect in short, vivid lyrics that were meant to be sung to the lyre. Her style was intimate and rich with imagery. Evening star, you bring back all that the shining day has scattered. Words like these have outlived empires. And then, as quietly as she appeared in the historical record, she faded away. Much of her work is lost, burned, buried, or ignored. But what is left proves one thing: she did not need monuments. Her poems were her monument. And today, when we speak of passion in verse, of love without shame, of a longing that crosses centuries, we are still whispering her name, Sappho. To understand Sappho, you must first understand Lesbos, the island that nurtured her voice. Lesbos was not a remote place in the ancient Greek world. It was a thriving center of art, music, and philosophy. With its fertile valleys, olive groves, and coastal winds carrying the scent of salt and flowers, Lesbos was both a physical paradise and a cultural treasure. It was not Athens. It did not need to be. It had its own rhythm, slower, more sensual, and rooted in a tradition of lyric poetry. Here, music was not just decoration. It was devotion. The sounds of the lyre and aulos echoed through homes and temples. Poetry was sung, not read. And in this world of sound and nature, Sappho's voice was born. She lived in the city of Mytilene, the island's busy heart. Politics flourished here, and so did art. The island was home to poets and philosophers, rival groups, and shifting allegiances. Sappho herself was once exiled, possibly to Sicily, during a time of political unrest. But it was always Lesbos that she called home. It was her muse. Lesbos was also a place of female community, which was rare in the ancient world. Girls from aristocratic families were educated in music, poetry, and ritual. Some scholars believe Sappho led a kind of thyasos, a circle or school where young women learned the art of lyric poetry, dance, and devotion to the goddess Aphrodite. This was not formal education as we know it, but a sacred, creative sisterhood. Here, bonds were formed that were emotional, intellectual, and possibly romantic. Sappho wrote directly to these women, not as abstract ideas, but as real people in her life. She called them by name, grieved their departures, celebrated their beauty, and confessed her love with raw honesty. In one fragment, she writes, "I have not had one word from her. I beg you, bring her back to me." These lines do not come from myth or theater. They come from a lived experience, a circle of women singing by lamplight, weaving their emotions into song. And though time would later distort her legacy, framing it with scandal or speculation, Lesbos was the ground from which her truth grew. It was not just a place on a map, but a cultural cradle of passion, art, and female expression. Sappho did not just live on Lesbos. She became Lesbos, its breath, its heart, its voice. In an age when the great epics of Homer praised gods and heroes, and men filled scrolls with stories of battles and conquests, Sappho wrote about the heart. She did not sing of war. She sang of a trembling hand, a shy glance, a voice that made her body shiver. She was one of the first poets in Western history to write in the first person. Not just telling stories, but feeling them. And what she felt was love, longing, jealousy, tenderness, and desire. Most astonishing of all, she wrote as a woman to women about women. In ancient Greece, a woman's voice was often limited to the home or silenced completely. Public life, literature, politics, philosophy, these were the domains of men. But Sappho stepped outside those boundaries, not with defiance, but with rhythm. Her poetry did not demand space. It created its own, a private world where emotion was not a weakness, but a strength. And in that space, she did something radical. She named the women she loved. She did not reduce them to symbols. She did not speak only in metaphors. She remembered their laughter, their perfume, the way they braided their hair. In one fragment, she describes the feeling of seeing someone she loves. He is equal to the gods, that man who sits beside you, who listens to your sweet voice and watches your lovely laughter. Oh, it makes my heart beat fast. Here, Sappho is the observer, watching the woman she loves speak to another. Her jealousy is quiet, aching, and deeply human. In just a few lines, she captures the full weight of unrequited love, something every listener, then or now, can understand. Her words were sensual but never vulgar. She wrote about intimacy with the care of a painter. The curve of a neck, the softness of sleep, the way moonlight touched the skin. She did not separate beauty from intimacy. They were one and the same. Because of this, later centuries often misunderstood or censored her. Some tried to erase her queerness. Others turned her heartbreak into a tragic myth. But none of that changes the truth of her voice. A woman who wrote honestly, lyrically, and bravely about love, not in theory, but as someone who had lived it, deeply, openly, and without apology. Sappho did not just write poetry. She composed music for the soul. Her verses were never meant to be read silently. In ancient Greece, poetry was alive. It was sound, breath, and vibration. Sappho's form was the lyric, short and intensely personal, meant to be performed with a lyre, a small stringed instrument held in the lap and plucked gently, while the voice carried the words like a breeze over the sea. This was the heart of lyric poetry, and it is where the word lyrical comes from. The poetry was not epic. It did not tell long stories of war and gods. It was intimate, emotional, and immediate. The lyric was a whisper, a confession, a love letter sung under fig trees or in candlelit rooms. And Sappho was its undisputed master. Her poems were written in Aeolic Greek, a regional dialect with a soft and rhythmic quality. Her preferred meter, now known as the sapphic stanza, flowed with a particular beat. 3 long lines followed by a shorter, more impactful one, like a sigh at the end of a longing thought. It was subtle and musical, like the rise and fall of breath in a quiet moment between lovers. She would have performed these songs surrounded by women, students, companions, maybe even priestesses. These gatherings, which may have been ritual or educational, were also spaces of freedom, where emotion, song, and body were not separate, but whole. Through these performances, Sappho trained others in the art of composition, creating not just poems but a culture. We can only imagine what it sounded like. the soft pluck of strings, the clear rise of her voice, the stillness of listeners hanging on every word. Many of her poems begin not with statements, but with questions or prayers, like the start of a conversation. Come to me now, O golden-throned Aphrodite, and free me from hard care. These were poems that reached out to the gods and inward to desire, and yet they feel surprisingly modern. You could set them to music today, and they would still stir something raw and real. Sappho turned poetry into song, and in doing so, she reminded the world that emotion is music, that every heartache, every thrill of touch, deserves a melody. And hers is a melody that is still echoing centuries later. For every line of Sappho's poetry we have today, dozens, perhaps hundreds, have been lost. What is left are fragments, pieces of emotion and sound, phrases torn from their original songs, drifting through time. Some are complete stanzas, others are mere whispers, a single word, a hint of longing, a final thought without a beginning. And yet, even these broken pieces pulse with life, like glowing embers in the ash of something that was once brilliant. Why did so much disappear? Time, war, and deliberate destruction. Sappho's works were once collected into 9 volumes, organized in the famous Library of Alexandria. These were likely copied and recited throughout the classical world. But with the fall of that library, much of ancient literature was lost. Later, as Christian influence grew, many works that were considered pagan or immoral were suppressed, neglected, or intentionally burned. Sappho's poetry, filled with passion, especially for same-sex love, made her a target. By the medieval period, she had become a ghost. Her name survived, but her voice was almost completely silenced. Only through quotations by other authors, saved in grammar books, commentaries, or philosophical works, did bits of her poetry survive. These fragments were often cited for their style or vocabulary, not for their emotional power. Yet the feelings still came through. Then came the papyri. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists digging in the sands of Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, found thousands of scraps of ancient manuscripts. Among them, torn and faded, were lines by Sappho, bits of songs that had not been seen for over 1,000 years. More discoveries followed. In 2004, a nearly complete poem was found on a papyrus wrapped around a mummy in Germany. Each recovery felt like a resurrection, and yet so much is still missing. We read her today in echoes. What we long for is not just what she wrote, but what she might have said if history had let her speak without being interrupted. Still, there is something fitting in this survival through fragments. Sappho wrote about things that do not last, about fleeting moments, about a beauty that slips through the fingers like sand. And so, perhaps it is fitting that her poetry comes to us not as a monument, but as a mystery, a puzzle pieced together by lovers of language, of music, of the heart. A voice once drowned in fire, still burning. Sappho's poetry was too honest to avoid judgment. In her own time, she was admired, even celebrated, as a master of lyric poetry. Plato called her the 10th muse, placing her among the gods. Yet, as centuries passed and cultures changed, her legacy was twisted, silenced, or turned into a scandal, depending on the era. Why? Because she wrote about love, and not the kind that history was comfortable remembering. Much of her poetry is about deep affection and desire for women. She praised their beauty, mourned their absence, confessed her jealousy, and celebrated their intimacy. In her world, this was not unusual. In the cultural environment of Lesbos, especially among aristocratic women, close emotional and possibly romantic bonds were accepted, even honored. But later generations, especially under Roman, Christian, and Victorian values, had trouble with this. Instead of facing her truth, they rewrote her story. Medieval scribes ignored her. Renaissance translators softened her language. Victorians portrayed her as a tragic romantic, heartbroken over a man, even inventing the myth that she jumped to her death from a cliff for the love of a ferryman named Phaon, a story that does not appear in any of her authentic work. This made-up story had a purpose: to erase her queerness, to make her pain more acceptable, and her desires more conventional. Some critics reduced her poetry to being merely educational or platonic. Others dismissed her completely as indecent, and yet she endured even in scandal. Sappho's name survived. In the 19th century, when open discussion of same-sex love was still taboo, her legacy quietly became a coded symbol for queer identity. The words sapphic and lesbian became terms for romantic love between women, taken directly from her name and her home. She became, without ever intending to, a poetic ancestor for those whose loves had been silenced. And the debates still continue today. Who was she? A teacher? A lover? A myth? A threat? But maybe the better question is, why are we still afraid of her truth? Sappho did not write to fit into categories. She wrote what she felt. She named beauty, confessed her longing, and lived through her verses. Her scandal was not in her actions. It was in her honesty. She dared to write about desire, and for that, history tried to silence her voice. But it never could. If there was one divine presence that watched over Sappho's life and work, it was Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and irresistible desire. To Sappho, Aphrodite was not just a myth. She was a muse, a confidant, and even a companion in moments of passion and heartbreak. Many of Sappho's most powerful verses are not just about love. They are prayers to Aphrodite, invocations, pleas, and arguments made in verse when the weight of longing became too heavy to bear. In her most famous surviving poem, Ode to Aphrodite, Sappho does not just praise the goddess. She speaks to her directly, almost like a friend who has heard this story before. Come to me now, if ever you have answered my voice in the past. Free me from hard care, fulfill all that my heart longs to achieve. There is no shame in this vulnerability, no fear in expressing desire. Sappho's love is never shown as sinful or weak. It is divine, something sacred enough to bring a goddess down from the heavens. In the ancient world, Aphrodite was not just about romance. She ruled over attraction, seduction, the chemistry between bodies, and the ache of separation. To call on her was to acknowledge that love could wound just as much as it could thrill. Sappho captured that duality perfectly. She did not idealize love. She lived inside its contradictions. She wrote of its sweetness and its sting, its beauty and its cruelty. In another poem, she writes, "Love shook my soul like the wind on the mountain, troubling the oak trees." Here, love is not gentle. It is violent, elemental, something that tears through you without asking for permission. By placing Aphrodite at the center of her emotional world, Sappho raised longing to a mythic level. Her poems blurred the line between the personal and the divine, between everyday emotion and cosmic force. And in doing so, she helped create a literary legacy where love was not just a theme, it was a form of worship. For Sappho, Aphrodite was not an abstract deity. She was a mirror, a force that reflected back all the intensity, the confusion, and the beauty of the human heart. And in every line of Sappho's verse, the goddess of love listens and replies. Like her poetry, Sappho's death is a mystery wrapped in myth. No one knows exactly when she died, how old she was, or even where she spent her final years. Some say she died peacefully on Lesbos, surrounded by the sea and the songs she loved. Others, especially later Roman poets, created tragic stories that she jumped to her death from the white cliffs of Leucadia, heartbroken over an unrequited love for the handsome ferryman Phaon. But there is no historical evidence for that story. It seems more like an invention, a way for a male-dominated literary tradition to reframe her love and suffering as a heterosexual tragedy. It turned the powerful, poetic voice of a woman who loved women into a victim of unreturned affection for a man. A neat ending, perhaps, but a false one. The truth is simpler and more profound. Sappho disappeared as quietly as she arrived. After her death, her work lived on for centuries. She was studied by philosophers, quoted by playwrights, and sung in performances across the ancient Greek world. Her poetry was preserved in 9 books, a treasure of lyric verse. For a time, her fame was as great as Homer's. But history is not kind to voices that challenge its norms. With the rise of the Roman Empire and Later, the dominance of Christian moral codes, Sappho's openly emotional and sensual poems, especially those celebrating female love, became unpopular. Her writings were no longer copied. Her volumes were left to decay in libraries that would eventually burn or fall apart. Some believe her works were intentionally destroyed by early church officials who saw her songs as dangerous. By the Middle Ages, her name remained, but her words were mostly gone. It would take over 1,000 years before fragments of her verses reappeared, found in Egyptian trash heaps or quoted in ancient grammar books. Piece by piece, she was reborn not through myth but through survival. Her death may be lost to time, but her disappearance was never complete. She lingered in whispers, in stolen lines written in margins, in the persistent ache of voices that refused to be forgotten. Sappho did not need a heroic death. Her poems were already immortal, and in the gaps where her words once lived, we can still feel the shape of her spirit, yearning, unfinished, but never truly gone. Sappho's life may be lost in shadows, her verses scattered and incomplete, but her influence has never faded. If anything, it has only grown stronger, like a candle that flickers but refuses to go out. In every age, someone has rediscovered her. In the Renaissance, scholars studied her fragments, amazed at her delicate control of emotion. In the Romantic era, poets like Byron and Shelley called upon her name. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as conversations about gender and identity began to reawaken, Sappho became a symbol of queer resilience, of feminine artistry, and of emotional freedom. Her name lives on in language itself. Sapphic, used to describe romantic love between women, and lesbian, taken from the island of her birth, is now a global identity. These words are not just terms. They are echoes of her life, proof that a voice can ripple across thousands of years and still reshape how we understand love and expression. Artists, writers, and musicians continue to be drawn to her. Painters have imagined her at the lyre, bathed in moonlight. Poets have translated her again and again, each version trying to find the pulse beneath the words. Modern authors have reimagined her, reclaimed her, and resurrected her in novels, songs, and plays. And through it all, one thing remains clear. Sappho speaks to something universal. It does not matter that her poems are broken. It does not matter that her biography is unclear. What matters is the emotion that burns beneath the words. The trembling joy of desire, the ache of separation, the sacredness of beauty. These are feelings we all carry. She just found a way to sing them. Perhaps that is her true immortality. Not the marble statues or the scholarly footnotes, but the way a few lines from over 2,000 years ago can still make someone pause, breathe, and feel less alone. Sappho's gift was never just poetry. It was presence. She made feeling an art. She made longing a form of truth. And in doing so, she became more than a poet. She became a mirror for anyone who has ever loved, quietly, deeply, or in defiance of the world. And as long as human hearts break and heal through language, Sappho will remain not just remembered, but felt.